The North Sea hissed and frothed beneath a sky the colour of beaten iron. A ragged wind swept across the coastal assembly ground, carrying with it the salt of the waves and the hush of gathered men. They stood in a wide circle, boots sunk in frost-hardened earth, rough cloaks drawn tight against the chill. At the centre, a man on his knees, bound at the wrists, hair matted with brine and blood. This was not a place of kings and thrones, but of axes and words, the Thing, the ancient gathering of free Norsemen, where law was spoken aloud beneath the open sky, binding each man to his neighbour by the power of his word and his sword. A hush fell as the law speaker, old and stern, stepped forward. His cloak of undyed wool flapped around his legs like the wings of a restless bird. In his hand, a staff carved with runes, the sign that he spoke not for himself, but for the people, and the gods who watched from beyond the wind and waves. "Hearken," he called out, his voice rolling like distant thunder. "Before all free men gathered here, let it be known, this man, Hakon Ketilsson, has broken trust. He has stolen from his bloodkin. He has betrayed guest right. He has raised false witness against an elder. For this, by the ancient law of our fathers, he is declared níðingr." A ripple of breath passed through the crowd, a sound not quite gasp, not quite sigh, but something older. Fear, níðingr, worse than thief, worse than murderer. A word spat from the tongue, like rotten fish from the gut. It meant unman, oath-breaker, honourless fit, neither for hearth nor hall nor grave. Hakon's eyes darted from face to face. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but the rope at his wrists bit deeper with each shudder. He saw his brothers there, staring at him like he was a carcass already rotting on the ground. He saw the old neighbours he had helped roof a longhouse for just 2 winters past. None would meet his gaze now. Beside the law speaker, 2 farmers stepped forward, bearing a tall, rough-hewn pole. Lashed to its top, freshly severed, was the head of a mare, the níðstang, the pole of shame. Its dead eyes stared toward Hakon's homestead, its tongue lolling like a curse spat from the mouth of the gods themselves. "With this pole," intoned the law speaker, "we cut you off from kin and clan. May your name rot on men's tongues. May no man shelter you. May the land itself spit you out. You are outlaw. You are wolf-headed. You are hunted from this hour until the end of your miserable days." The crowd answered as one, "So be it." A stone dropped in the sea, and the world closed over it without ripple. What did it mean to stand condemned beneath the open sky of the north? In the long memory of the Viking world, the law was not paper and ink sealed behind palace doors. It was not the rule of robed clerics who whispered mercy in the name of distant saints. It was something harsher, older, spoken aloud, where all could hear and remember. A free man's life was bound by honour, like the prow of a ship to its keel. Without it, he drifted, rudderless, lost to storm and hunger and wolves, the real ones, and the ones that walked on 2 legs. To be declared níðingr was not a sentence to prison. There were no walls strong enough to hold a Norseman, nor chains enough to bind his kin to inaction. No, this punishment was far crueler. It cast a man beyond the law's protection, beyond all human fellowship. From that moment he was less than a thrall, less than a dog. Any man might kill him, without fear of feud or vengeance. No door would open to him, no fire would warm him. Even the earth itself, come death, might not keep him, for the níðingr was often denied, a grave within hallowed ground. And so Hakon was dragged to the edge of the clearing. A spear haft slammed into his ribs, shoving him into the mud. His bindings were cut, but the knife that freed him was not mercy, only a signal that he was nothing now. He turned, eyes wild, but already the circle was breaking. Men turned their backs. Some spat. His brothers did not look at him again. He stumbled to his feet, breath ragged, tasting blood and the salt spray that came roaring off the sea. Somewhere behind him, the níðstang rattled in the wind, its carved horse head staring at his empty homestead far up the hill. There would be no hearth waiting for him there, now only cold ash and silent walls. He ran. The grass tore beneath his boots. The brambles clawed at his cloak. He did not see the boys who would come later to tear down his roof beams for firewood, the neighbours who would herd his cattle as if they'd never been his. He did not see the small figure of his mother kneeling by the hearth fire, staring into the dark with eyes dry and empty. He only ran, into the wild, into the forest that was no longer part of any world he knew. Behind him, the sea roared, and the law that no Christian king, no feudal court, no monastery bell could ever comprehend rang louder still in the minds of those who watched him vanish. The níðingr lives only as long as his hunters allow. Thus was the forbidden law, the terrible law spoken into life. It was a punishment so merciless that even in an age of raiders and sword-edged justice, it stood apart, a terror that bound Viking society together with iron threads of shame and fear. In the north, there was no prison to hide a crime. There was only the wind, the wild, and the certainty that the worst fate was not death, but dishonour that outlived your name. And so begins our journey into the cold, brutal heart of Norse justice. A law too fierce, too raw, too ancient for the soft courts of medieval Europe to ever endure. The wind cut low across the fjord that spring morning, carrying the hush of meltwater trickling beneath last winter's frost. Beneath a sky veined with thin grey clouds, men gathered in a wide circle on a levelled patch of earth, boots planted in damp grass, hands resting on axe hafts and staves. There were no marble pillars here, no robed judges, no stone halls echoing with the language of priests and parchment. This was the thing, the living heart of Norse justice, where free men spoke the law aloud, beneath open sky, and bound one another to it, with memory, oath, and steel. Bjorn Thorvaldsson stood near the outer ring, a farmer's son with broad shoulders and soil under his fingernails. His breath showed white in the dawn chill as he scanned the faces around him. Neighbours, cousins, elders whose beards were heavy with age and whose eyes had seen too many seasons to fear any man's boast. All had gathered to hear disputes settled, crimes judged, prices set for wounds opened and blood spilled. For in this place the old ways held a man's worth, weighed not only in silver or cattle, but in honour and the hidden weight of his word. Near the centre, the law speaker stepped forward, his staff carved with runes older than any king's crown. He carried no sword, yet his tongue could send men to ruin or peace. His memory was the record of all who came before the line of spoken law, reaching back through generations that never touched ink or script. His voice cut through the murmurs like a blade through wool, and Bjorn felt his gut tighten as his name was called. He had come to settle a grievance. His neighbour's cattle had broken the fence during the deep snows, tearing down the last stacks of hay that were meant to keep Bjorn's herd alive through the bitter end of winter. Now his cows calved weak and thin, and hunger gnawed at his household like a wolf at the door. In this clearing, revenge was an easy thought, but a dangerous one. To strike at his neighbour with an axe would bring no justice, only the threat of a blood feud, two families trading violence until winter or the sword finished them both. So here Bjorn stood, shoulder to shoulder, with men who had once sailed to distant shores to take silver and iron by force, but who now turned inward to bind their own restless blood to words instead of blades. The neighbour stepped forward to swear his defence, claiming the snow had crushed the fence, that no fault lay in his hand. Witnesses spoke, 2 old men who'd seen the post splinter, a boy who'd driven the stray cattle back under moonlight, his thin voice quivering as he told the circle what he knew. Every word spoken before the law speaker bound the speakers to truth, for a lie spoken here was poison to the tongue and a stain that could mark a family for generations. When the verdict came, it was not loud. The law speaker spoke evenly, naming the measure of silver and livestock owed to Bjorn in payment for the lost hay, for the lean calves, for the insult of a broken fence left mended too late. The circle murmured, heads nodding or turning aside, weighing the worth of the ruling against what each man knew of justice and survival. Bjorn's jaw tightened. He had wanted more repayment in shame, not just in cattle. But the thing offered no room for endless blood. It cut feud short with silver, with words that forced men back inside their fences before rage could spread from farm to farm like fire through dry grass. As the neighbour stepped forward to seal the promise with an open hand, Bjorn clasped it because he must. To break with the thing was to stand alone in a land that punished the lone man more surely than any sword. He could feel the eyes of his kin on him, the old men marking how he'd spoken well, but yielded, the boys watching with wide eyes, learning how the world truly held together. This was how it had always been. Long before the Norse called themselves Vikings, long before their longships touched foreign sands and brought back tales of burning monasteries and silken treasure, men had stood in forest clearings and open fields to speak the law into life. It was older than the runes carved on standing stones, older than the memory of any crown. In this place, all were free men if they could stand within the circle and meet another's gaze without shame. Here, honour was shield and chain alike, binding each man to his kin, his land, his word. Without this binding, every grievance was a spark waiting for kindling. A stolen sheep could start a quarrel that bled out into generations of revenge. A false word spoken in secret could blacken a name and bring knives to a neighbour's door by moonlight. But the thing was the hearth around which these dangerous embers were kept in check. The punishment for breaking its peace was harsh, not because the Norse loved cruelty for its own sake, but because their world offered no other walls. If a man refused the ruling, if he turned his back on the circle's word, then the worst fate awaited him. Outlawry, not prison, for no prison could hold the spirit of men who crossed oceans with axes under sailcloth. Not torture racks behind stone walls, for the Norse feared no pain as much as they feared shame. Instead, the law would strip him of all bonds. He would walk the woods a ghost in his own land, cursed by a nith pole raised at his threshold, hunted like a wolf whose death brought no vengeance upon the hunter's kin. This was the root of the brutal law that would make Christian missionaries shudder and foreign scribes write of northern savagery in trembling Latin. In the north, where the sea clawed at the coasts and the forests closed behind any man who stepped too far from his people, the greatest terror was not the axe, but the empty silence that came when one's name was cut away from clan and kin. So Bjorn took his small victory, a calf come summer, a measure of silver to mend the fence, a quiet night at his hearth, without fear that tomorrow's dawn might bring his neighbour's sons armed for vengeance. As he turned away from the thing, the circle broke behind him, folding back into the world of farms and fjords and the long struggle for life in a land where winter always waited just beyond the door. His boys watched him go, learning in silence that in this place a man's tongue and his oath were his strongest shield until the day he failed to keep them, and the law's shadow turned from protection to doom. In this circle of rough boots on damp earth, the Norse ancient law lived older than the kingdoms that would one day rise and call it barbaric, brutal, yes. But for a world carved by iron and ice, it was the only bond strong enough to keep the dark at bay. In the hush that followed the breaking of the Thing, Bjorn Thorvaldsson walked home through a forest path where the first pale buds of spring pushed through last year's rot. His boots crushed damp leaves, his breath ghosted behind him, and his mind turned over the verdict like a stone in a cold stream. A calf in payment, a bag of silver weighed against insult. It was enough, said the law, enough to quiet the feud before blood demanded more blood. But in his chest, where hunger and pride coiled together, Bjorn felt the old truth stir. To live among his kin was to be known as a man who would stand and bend, but never break. In the Viking world, to be free was not only to hold land or swing an axe on a raid across the whale road, it was to keep a name unsullied by cowardice, treachery, or shame. A man could lose his hand in battle, his ship to a storm, his brother to the frost, but if he lost his honour, he lost everything. Without it, even his bloodkin would turn their faces to the hearth when he came through the door, leaving him standing at the threshold as cold as the wind that battered the sod roof. Honour was more than pride. It was the invisible thread that stitched a family together, that made men stand shoulder to shoulder when foreign sails darkened the horizon, or wolves circled the cattle at dusk. It bound old grudges in iron bands, and gave weight to promises spoken across the fire. If a man broke his word, if he spoke lies at the Thing, or failed to answer an insult with steel or silver, that thread frayed. And when enough threads frayed, a clan came apart in silence and suspicion, an easy mark for hunger, for raiders, for the slow rot of shame. For some wrongs, silver could wash the stain away. A cut cheek, a broken tooth, a cow stolen in the lean months, these things had prices measured by the law speaker's tongue. But some stains sank deeper than any coin could reach. A man who betrayed his kin by murder or false witness, who violated the guest right that even the gods honoured, he could not buy back his standing with silver, no matter how heavy the bag he offered. For him, the only payment the Thing could demand was his very place among men. And so the worst punishment in Norse law was not a spear through the gut or an axe to the neck. It was the slow, creeping death of the níðingr the outcast, whose name became poison on the tongue. Worse than a thief, worse than a murderer, the níðingr was a man stripped of all bonds, turned loose like a sick hound into the wild. He might live another year or 5 if the land was kind, and he found enough shelter in caves and forgotten hollows. But the law's mark hunted him more surely than any blade. Anyone could strike him down where he crawled, and no vengeance would follow, no feud, no blood price, no word spoken over his grave. The wolves would finish what the Thing had begun. The stories of the old sagas carried these truths, like sparks hidden in dry moss. There was Grettir Asmundarson, the strong, proud outlaw of Iceland, whose own kin could not shelter him when the Thing declared him a wolf's head. Grettir, who fought trolls in the night, and stole warmth from farmsteads when winter's teeth closed on his shoulders. Grettir, who died alone on a storm-blasted island, his name half cursed and half pitied in the long dark nights, when men whispered what became of those who slipped their bonds of honour. Even kings, for all their gold and the bright circle of swords at their hall doors, could not stand forever above this ancient reckoning. There were tales of chieftains who pushed the Thing too far, who ignored the law's silver and thought their spears could shield them from the circle's word. Some bought time, none bought peace. For when the law turned on a man in the north, it turned with the cold certainty of a winter tide, washing away his boasts and banners until only silence and shame remained. Honour did not bend to mercy as the priests of the White Christ might have wished. In the south, a sinner could confess his crimes to a robed man behind a wooden door, pay penance, and walk free in the eyes of heaven. But the north had no walls thick enough to seal away a man's stain. Here, the stain was his shadow long, patient, waiting for the thing to name it aloud. And once named, it clung to him like pitch on skin. This was why the law speaker's staff, rough with runes and worn smooth by calloused hands, was a sharper blade than any sword carried on a raid to Ireland or Francia. A sword could cut a man's flesh and scatter his gold. The law could cut his name from the living tapestry of kin and hearth and harvest, leaving him to drift through the cold seasons as a ghost in his own skin. So Bjorn, trudging back to his farmstead beneath the waking calls of ravens in the pines, understood that he had gained something more precious than a calf or a pouch of silver. He had kept his place at the hearth. His boys, watching from the smoke hole when he entered, would know their father had stood among free men and spoken his truth without shame. They would see him set down his axe by the door, not as a man broken by the law, but strengthened by it, bound to it as tightly as the frost bound the streams beneath the snow. Honour was life. Life was honour. In the Viking world, a man might die in battle beneath a falling tree, at sea beneath the howl of storm and surf. But he would not die forgotten if his name was carried by kin, untainted by disgrace. He would not rot in unmarked soil as a níðingr hunted by his own blood. That was the fate worse than any death, to live on with no one to speak your name, no door to open when the snow came, no voice to call you brother, father, friend. In the end, the brutal law was not a relic of savagery for its own sake. It was a shield, a warning, a hard truth hammered out beneath iron skies, and passed from tongue to tongue when the circle gathered at the thing. Life without honour was no life at all. And so the North, cold and sharp-edged as the axe at a chieftain's belt, forged its people in a promise spoken aloud by the firelight and the wind that a man's worth would stand taller than his flesh, so long as he never betrayed the name that gave him place among the living. Somewhere beyond Bjorn's farmstead, where the pasture fences gave way to the raw edge of the forest, the earth dipped into a ravine where the bones of old fires lay buried in ash and moss. They said that once, long ago, a man named Orm the Red had made his last stand here, not as a warrior at the prow of a dragon-headed ship, but as an outlaw, hunted through the pines like an animal, too cunning for the noose, yet too stained for any hearth to hold him. Orm had not always been a wolf's head. His story, like so many whispered between longhouse walls in the hush before sleep, began not with crime, but with anger. A drunken quarrel at a midwinter feast, a blade drawn too quick, blood spilled on the packed dirt floor where neighbours should have clasped hands. The man Orm killed was no stranger but a cousin, and kin blood on the ground weighed heavier than silver in the north. The thing met beneath spring's pale sun to weigh his fate. Orm stood before his kin, with his hands bound and his hair shorn close a mark of shame before the verdict fell. Outlawry, outlaws. The word cut deeper than any wound. It meant not just banishment, but the stripping away of all that made a man part of the living. From the moment the law speaker's staff struck the ground, Orm was no longer shielded by any bond of kin or oath. The same neighbours who once shared his ale and mended his fence were now free to run him down like a cornered boar. Worse still, if they brought back his head, there would be no blood feud, no vengeance, only the grim nod of the thing, which would say, "So be it, the law is kept." And so Orm ran, first to the distant upland farms, begging scraps in the night like a starving fox, then deeper into the forests, where the old charcoal pits and half-collapsed turf huts told stories of other men before him, names worn away by seasons and silence. Each outlaw was alone, yet all shared the same doom, to be unremembered except as a warning. The forest was wide, but the law's shadow was wider still. Hunters sent their hounds to sniff him out. Young men hungry for an easy kill prowled the ravines where he made his fire. Some nights he caught glimpses of them through the trees, cloaks tight against the cold, voices hushed as they tracked the ghost who had once sat beside them at the Thing. He knew his mother left bread and dried fish hidden at the edge of his old pasture, but he never dared touch it. If she was caught feeding him, her own neighbours could stand her before the law speaker for harbouring a wolf's head. The forest could be patient, men could not. This was the brutal secret behind the North's oldest punishment. The outlaw was more than a man alone, he was a lesson that walked on two legs. Each village, each fjord, each island settlement knew that to betray blood or break an oath was not just to risk death, but to vanish beyond the circle of firelight. Even the ravens perched in the trees above Orm's hidden shelter seemed to watch him with knowing eyes, as if the land itself had agreed with the Thing's verdict. Yet the outlaw was not always hunted down quickly. Some, like Grettir the Strong, became legends precisely because they refused to bow to the cold logic of the sentence. Grettir stole warmth from farmsteads when storms cut down the cattle in their stalls. He took what he needed to survive, but he never begged mercy. The sagas say he fought trolls and phantoms in the dark hills, as if the land itself was the only company left to a man stripped of men. But most outlaws were no saga heroes. They died beneath branches, heavy with snow, ribs showing through torn tunics, eyes open to the blackness above. Their bones vanished into the roots. Sometimes, decades later, a hunter or woodcutter might stumble upon a hollow in the earth, a rusted knife, a scrap of wool cloak, a few cracked ribs scattered like the memory of a name no one cared to speak aloud. To call Outlawry savage is easy for those who look back from centuries of stone prisons and written law codes bound in leather. But for the Norse, whose farms perched on the edge of cold seas and whose winters could devour whole villages in silence, the worst threat was not a murderer's axe, but the breaking of trust. Trust was the only fence against the wolves, the real ones and the ones who wore man's skin. The law that named a man Outlawry did not just cast him out, it sealed the circle of the living against him, hardened the walls around kin and hearth, so that one man's shame would not seep like rot into the bones of the rest. It was a punishment without walls, chains, or iron bars, but it was as certain as any blade. No king's guards were needed to drag Orm to a dungeon. No warden's whip cracked behind him. The forest did the work, the wind, the hunger, and the quiet refusal of 1,000 closed doors. If Orm's cousin had survived that winter quarrel, they might have stood side by side at the next Thing, argued over grazing rights, traded insults and laughter in equal measure. But the North was never kind to what-ifs. The only certainty was the law older than any crown, colder than the stones that marked the burial mounds by the fjords. Some nights, men who gathered at the Thing would glance at the forest's dark edge and wonder if Orm's ghost still watched them from the birch shadows. Perhaps it did. Perhaps the thought of that lonely figure, crouched beside a dying fire with no name left but Wolf's Head, was enough to hold a man's hand steady when his anger rose too quick, when the ale soured his tongue, when old insults begged to be answered with steel instead of silver. No written decree could match that power. No iron-bound jail could teach a man the price of honour, betrayed as sharply as the knowledge that to lose one's name was to lose the warmth of every hearth from the coast to the inland hills. Outlawry was exile from life itself, a sentence carried out not by guards, but by silence, fear, and the watching eyes of kin who loved their own names too much to risk them for a man who had cut himself away. So the stories of Orm the Red, of Grettir the Strong, of nameless others who once sat in the circle and then were cast beyond it, endured like frost in the soil, waiting for any foot that strayed too far from the path. And when the law-speaker's staff struck the earth and the word Outlawry fell from his lips, even the boldest warriors felt the hair lift on their arms, knowing that the forest was vast, the nights were long, and a man alone was no man at all. There were words in the Old North that stung deeper than any blade, words that could unmake a man more thoroughly than a spear thrust through the ribs. Among them, none dripped more poison than nith the word of shame, of scorn, of ritual unmanhood that stripped the flesh of its dignity and left only a husk for wolves and crows to pick apart. If outlawry made a man a ghost, nith made him something worse, a thing unclean, outside the reach of even the gods who guarded the doorways of home and hall. It was more than insult. It was a curse nailed to a man's name, so that every mouth that spoke it tasted ashes and spit. To call a man níðingr was to strip him of kinship, of manhood, of the invisible thread that bound him to the living. It was to say, "You are no longer one of us. May the land reject you as we do." No one took the word lightly. To accuse a man of nith without cause was itself a danger, for if the claim were proven false, the poison recoiled upon the speaker. False slander could bring its own verdict of outlawry, for a tongue that lied about such shame deserved to be silenced by the wild. But when true, when spoken beneath the open sky with witnesses to seal it, nith became law, and law in the north. For all its spoken nature was iron hard once loosed into the wind. So they raised the pole the níðstang, tall and rough as a winter-bare tree. They carved runes into its shaft that bound the shame like nails to flesh. At the top, a horse's head, severed clean and set to rot, its muzzle turned toward the land or homestead of the man condemned. Its blind eyes glared over fields that would now wither in rumour and curse, for the nith did not stop at the flesh but sank into the soil, made the world itself an enemy to the one it marked. Children would cross themselves in later days, whispering that such magic was pagan filth, but even then, behind church walls, some old bones of fear would remain. Imagine it, a coastal farm, the salt wind off the fjord carrying the reek of blood and splintered wood. The condemned man's neighbours gather at dusk when the law speaker has spoken the doom aloud. They drive the pole deep into the earth at the boundary of his land. Maybe his mother weeps behind shuttered doors. Maybe his brothers stand silent by the hearth, knowing that to protest now is to risk the same verdict. The horse's head drips its last warmth onto frozen ground. Ravens circle above, drawn by the promise of carrion. No hand will bury it. The pole stands as long as rot and wind allow. It points like an accusing finger at the dwelling of the níðingr. From that hour, no fire will welcome him, no bench will bear his weight, no cup will pass his lips in friendship. His name becomes a ghost at the thing, unspoken except in stories meant to hold other men back from his path. What crime demanded such a sentence? Not mere theft, nor the killing of a man in fair fight, for these had prices, paid in silver, in cattle, in blood, if the thing failed to keep peace. But a man who broke the deepest bonds, who murdered kin in cold blood, who betrayed a sworn guest under his roof, who raised false witness in matters so grave, They tore the weave of family apart. He called the nith upon himself, like frost on ripe grain. It was not the gods alone who demanded such a reckoning, but the people, the clan, the neighbours whose lives depended on trust, as surely as on the fishing boats and barley fields. Where kings in distant lands built stone towers and gallows to tame men by force, the North gave its folk the threat of becoming unclean in the eyes of all. The fear of being marked níðingr did what no guard with an iron key could manage. It turned every eye in the settlement into a sentinel. It made the mind its own prison. There were men who tried to escape the word. Some fled before the pole rose, slipping onto ships that hugged the coast under cover of fog. They crossed the grey whale road to Iceland, to the Faroes, to lands so new that rumour outran news of their shame. But the sagas tell how even there the past rode the waves like a ghost. A man whose name carried nith found himself shunned in every hall. A new farm might shelter him for a season, but whispers spread faster than winter storms. Some fought back. The bravest or most desperate might tear down the pole in secret, burn it in the forest, and return to the thing with an axe in hand, swearing by steel that the accusation was false. Sometimes they won if they could prove it with blood or witness. More often they died on the same ground where they once stood proud among neighbours. For when a man's word was worth less than the wind, what blade could restore it? So the nith lingered on the tongue of the North like a bitter root. It grew in stories told by the hearth to restless boys who dreamed of ships and glory. It lay behind warnings, carved in runes on standing stones, that mark the limits of land and kin's silent reminders that a man's worst enemy might be the shame that slept beneath his own roof. When the Christian priests came with their parchments and prayers, they found the word nith hard to wash away. They wrote of it as witchcraft, as the black work of pagan sorcery. They misunderstood. The nith was no spell. It was older than the runes that named it, older than Odin's hanging on the tree. It was the ancient recognition that sometimes the worst punishment was not to be killed, but to be cast out alive, carrying dishonour like frostbite in the bone, until the land itself turned against you. Even today, in the sagas that survived fire and sword and time's slow hunger, the word still lingers. To read it is to hear a faint echo of a time when reputation was life's breath, when the harshest law did not come from distant kings, but from the circle of neighbours who watched a man stand alone while the horse's head rotted on, its pole silent and accusing as the wind howled across the empty fields. The wind that carried salt from the fjords also carried curses, or so the old women said when they watched the men haul the horse's head up the slope at dusk. Behind them, the land lay quiet, but for the hiss of the surf and the creak of ropes against rough-cut wood. At the edge of the settlement, where the boundary stones rose from the frostbitten earth like broken teeth, the men worked in silence to raise the níðstang, the pole of shame, that would stand long after flesh had rotted away. There was nothing hasty about this ritual. It was not the brawl of a drunken fight or the quick verdict of an angry chieftain. The raising of the pole was slow, deliberate, older than any rune carved on church doors or cross-raised by missionaries. The men chosen for the task were not warriors this night, though axes hung from their belts. They were neighbours, cousins, men who had shared ale with the condemned man not so many winters ago. Their silence was not fear, but resolve. The cold echo of a decision made when the law speaker's staff struck the ground at the thing, and the word níðingr fell like iron into water. They came first to the byre at the edge of the condemned man's land. A black mare stood there, restless, nostrils flaring at the scent of pitch and sweat. Her death was quick. A single cut behind the ear, the warmth of her blood steaming in the dusk. They spoke no prayers to Odin, nor to the Christ, for this was older than any god's mercy, older than any priest's forgiveness. The horse's head, severed clean, was lashed with sinew to the sharpened top of the pole, its tongue forced through its teeth so it seemed to snarl at the land that had turned its back on its master. When the pole was ready, they carried it through the field in pairs, boots sinking into ruts left by the last plough before snow hardened the soil. At the boundary, they dug a hole with iron spades, sweat steaming from backs beneath rough cloaks. No one spoke the condemned man's name, not tonight. To name him now was to share his shame, to let the rot creep under one's own roof. When the hole was deep enough, they stood the pole upright. It rose taller than a man, its base packed with cold earth, its shadow thin and needle-like under the rising moon. They turned the horse's head, so its dead eyes glared at the farmstead, at the turf roof where children might still lie awake, listening for footsteps that would never cross the threshold again. Somewhere in the dark, an old dog barked once, then fell silent. The law speaker, an elder with hair, the colour of snowmelt, stepped forward. In his hand, he held a knife whose bone handle was carved with runes, older than his grandfather's grave. He scored the bark at the base of the pole, cutting runes of curse and banishment into the raw wood. These marks were not for any god's eye, but for the land itself, a signal that the man who once belonged here now stood outside the weave that bound people, animals, earth and sky into one fragile whole. One by one, each man stepped forward and placed his hand on the pole. No words were needed. The gesture bound them to the verdict, to one another, to the grim promise that they would not break the circle by harbouring the outcast. If he came begging in the night, no bread would pass to his palm. If he tried to slip back inside the hall where his mother waited by the hearth, no kin would hide him under the skins. If he died in the woods beyond the boundary stones, they would bury him shallow, if at all. When the last man's hand lifted from the rough bark, the elder stepped back. The night wind fluttered his cloak like a shroud as he turned to face the farmstead one final time. Somewhere behind the shuttered windows, someone wept, but no door opened, no feet came running. The law was iron and ice, now a bond too cold for pity. They left the pole standing, the horse's head bobbing slightly as the wind shifted off the sea. Some said that if you listened closely, you could hear the dead mare's breath sighing through the gap in her teeth. In truth, it was only the wind through split bone and frozen mane, but in the north, truth and dread often shared the same skin. For weeks the pole would stand there, a monument to the thing's verdict. Birds would come to peck at the horse's flesh, until only the skull remained, bleached and staring. Children would creep to the edge of the fields to glimpse it, daring each other to touch the wood and run back before the spirit of the níðingr could curse them with his hunger. Travellers passing the boundary would make signs with their hands, muttering half-remembered charms, so that the shame would not follow them back to their own hearths. The condemned man, wherever he skulked in the dark folds of the forest, would feel its gaze even through the pines. Every footstep cracking a twig in the underbrush, every crow that wheeled above him in silence, every shadow between the trees reminded him that he was seen, even unseen, that the land had turned its face from him, just as his people had. Long after the wind brought the pole down, long after the horse's skull lay hidden in tall grass or buried by snow, the memory remained. No new man would build his fence line across that spot without remembering whose shame once pointed that way. And no neighbour who helped raise the pole would forget the feel of the rough bark beneath his palm, or the way the law-speaker's knife carved truth into wood, harder than any man's flesh. So the North kept its peace not with chains, but with the fear of the pole, a fear that bound men more tightly than iron bars ever could. A reminder that here, at the world's ragged edge, to lose one's place among kin and land was a death slower and colder than any axe could grant. The night after the pole was raised, the outcast lay awake beneath a ledge of rock in the black hush of the pines. Around him, the forest whispered with old voices, the creak of ice forming in the stream, the faint scrape of a fox's paws across frozen leaves, the low moan of wind as it found the gaps between trunk and stone. He could see the glow of his old farmstead if he crawled far enough to the edge, just a smear of warmth on the dark belly of the land. But he dared not look too long. The warmth was not for him anymore. In the morning, he rose, stiff-limbed, hungry. He knew the snow would betray him if he lingered. Footprints would wind down from the ridge like a trail of spilled blood. By dawn, the dogs would pick up his scent. The hunt was not spoken of openly when the pole was first planted, but every man knew it would come. For outlawry in the Old North was not just exile, it was invitation. An open season, a promise. The níðingr is no man, no kin will avenge him. Strike him down, and the law will call you righteous. There were boys in every village who dreamed of such a hunt. Young men with something to prove to the fathers, who weighed them too soft for the thing's circle. A wolf's head was worth more than a raid on a distant shore. It was a test done under the eyes of your own people, the story that would be spoken at the hearth when winter nights grew long and silent. So the condemned moved like a shadow that did not wish to touch the world too hard. He drank meltwater from the hollow of stones. He broke the ice at the edge of a pond and caught a trout with numb fingers, teeth tearing at raw flesh before the frost could turn his blood to iron. He slept shallow, ears pricked for the snap of branches under boot leather. But the forest was wide only until the dogs found your path. Then the world shrank to the sound of howls echoing through the trees, the crunch of men's feet in brittle snow, the barked laughter when they found your fire's cold ashes still steaming under pine boughs. They said the hunt was mercy of a kind that a quick death by spear or axe was kinder than the slow starvation that would come when the creeks froze solid and the wind drove every beast to burrow deeper than any man could dig. But the mercy was not for the níðingr. It was for those who hunted him to wipe the shame from the land, to ensure that his ghost would not walk too near the fences when the cows calved in spring. Sometimes, when an outlaw was bold, he turned to face his pursuers. The sagas tell of such last stands, a man crouched in a narrow pass, blade dull from cutting saplings for shelter, waiting for the ring of iron on stone that meant the hunt had found him. There was no shield wall in the woods, no brothers at his back, only the knowledge that if he fell with the weapon in his hand, perhaps the gods would weigh that defiance heavier than his crime. More often, the end came without witness. A spear through the ribs as he slept curled beneath a fallen log. An arrow loosed from behind a stump, humming through the hush of snow, finding the soft part between shoulder and throat. Some said it was dishonourable to kill a man, so but a níðingr was not a man. The shame of him spread if left alive. Better that the spear found him swift than the winter wind found him starving. There were rewards for the hunters, too. Sometimes a share of his goods, if he had hidden them before the thing's verdict fell. Sometimes a cloak or a knife, claimed as proof that the wolf's head would trouble the village no more. But the real prize was the telling of it, the way a young man's voice would carry through the smoke-thick hall as he described the snow turning red beneath a felled tree, the way the outlaw's breath rattled like dry leaves before silence claimed him. For the kin left behind, there was no grave mound to tend, no stone to mark a name. To bury a níðingr inside the settlement's fences was to invite his disgrace into the roots of the living. If a body was found, it was dragged to the edge of the forest or buried beneath cairns where only wolves and storms would remember the shape of his bones. And yet, sometimes, the hunted slipped through the net of dogs and eager sons. There are tales half believed, half feared of outcasts, who learned the old ways of the wild so well that they lived for years beyond the law's reach. They dug hidden burrows beneath upturned tree roots, stole sheep in the night from farmsteads that dared not whisper their name for fear of calling the curse home again. They became half fable, half animal, a caution to children who listened to the wind scraping at the shutters and wondered if that was the outlaw's ghost come to peer through the cracks. But even these ghosts could not outrun the years. The winter always comes. The cold finds the strongest hands. The belly shrinks until even raw roots taste sweet. When the last thaw comes, some woodcutter might find the skull under a rotted log, teeth grinning in a frozen mockery of the man he once was, no name, no kin to speak it. Only the hush of the trees, remembering what the pole once promised, that no shame must be allowed to live longer than the law that cast it out. So the hunt was not merely a blood sport. It was the final act of the thing's verdict, the sharp edge that made the spoken word stronger than iron. Without it, outlawry would be a lie, an empty threat spoken in the warmth of the circle, but forgotten when the forest swallowed the condemned. The hunt made certain that the circle held that trust between men was stronger than hunger for easy mercy. And in the dark hollows where the outlaw crouched listening for the dogs, he knew this better than any law speaker ever could. He knew it in the gnaw of his gut, the frostbite blooming at his fingertips, the thunder in his chest when the distant horn told him the hunt was closing in. Better to die quickly than to linger, nameless, forever at the edge of the firelight that once made him a man. Long before parchment and ink carried the law into stone halls and cloisters, the North remembered its justice in the voices of storytellers who leaned close to the hearth, weaving memory into flame. Among these memories, none burned brighter or darker than the sagas of the blood feuds, tales of kin who turned spear against kin, of grudges that outlived the men who first spoke them, of outlaws who vanished into the wild, only to return when the snows melted red. In the winter hush of an Icelandic longhouse, boys would press closer when the old ones spoke of Egil Skallagrimsson, warrior, poet, and murderer. Egil was no common outlaw skulking like a cornered fox. He was a storm in a man's skin, born to a father whose temper could sour milk and whose axe found blood as easily as frost found bone. When Egil slew a boy at the age of 7 for mocking him, the village elders whispered that trouble had come walking on 2 legs. When he killed his first man in earnest at 12, the thing weighed whether to bind his family in shame. But his kin was strong, his father rich in cattle and sharp in tongue. Compensation was paid, oaths were spoken for now. Yet some men could not be contained by silver or sworn promises. In the sagas, Egil moves through the north like a storm cloud, too bright to vanish, too fierce to bend. His poems, Sting Kings and his sword, answers the sting with iron. When a feud flares, it flares through him. Land is lost, lives are lost, but the line between hero and níðingr never crosses fully, not for him. His kin stand behind him, pay his fines, shield him from the final word that would turn him into a wolf's head. They keep his name alive, though blood drips from every rune that spells it. But not all feuds ended with silver or skaldic verse. Some hardened, like frost, until the only thaw was blood. The Grettir saga tells of Grettir Asmundarson, whose strength was said to rival any dozen men, but who found himself alone in a land that no longer wished to hold him. His story is one of blows struck too hard, tempers that refused the calm word when insult was offered. When Grettir killed a man in self-defence, the thing demanded more than silver, they demanded distance. Exile first, then, when exile failed to cage him, outlawry. Grettir fled to the hills, the coasts, the far-flung isles where seals barked and storms sang hymns, older than any priest's Latin. He became the ghost at the edge of every farm's candlelight. Mothers warned children not to stray too far from the byre, lest Grettir's shadow catch them and carry them to the wild where no name could save them. Yet even Grettir, fierce as a bear at bay, felt the weight of the law's slow iron. His kin could not shelter him to do so, was to risk the same sentence, the same fate. So he slept beneath turf roofs of abandoned huts, fished in icy streams by moonlight, and swung his axe at any who came for the price on his head. For years, hunters came and went, some with dogs, some with steel, none willing to fight him face to face when the cold fire of his eyes met theirs. His end did not come in roaring battle, but by cunning. Betrayed by poison and trickery, Grettir fell not to spear, but to the slow rotting of a wound, and the soft tread of men who found him weakened and finished what the law had begun. They took his head, the only proof the thing required that the ghost had been brought to heal. His mother buried it with trembling hands, a grave unblessed, a name half-whispered, never fully pardoned. In these stories, the blood feud and the outlaw's curse were knotted together like roots beneath the soil. Where one ended, the other often began. A feud could push a man to kill. The killing could push the thing to outlaw him. His outlawry could provoke more killing, a brother seeking revenge, a cousin answering insult with steel. Each blow fed the next, each drop of blood the seed for another. Some villages could remember lines of feud that coiled back through 5 generations, each marked by graves on distant ridges, each spoken of in the hush of winter nights, when only the fire's crackle dared interrupt. The law's harshest edge, then, was not merely the axe or the spear. It was the certainty that once a man's shame escaped the circle of his kin, no shield wall could hold it back. It seeped into the bones of his family, poisoning their alliances, weighing on the next harvest when neighbours chose where to trade, whom to marry, whose sons to trust with secrets worth silver. The threat of the pole, the word nith, the long hunt through the forests, all of it was a net to catch the sparks before they set the whole settlement ablaze. And yet, paradoxically, it was the blood feud that kept the law alive. Without the threat of vengeance, what man would fear dishonour? Without the memory of Grettir's headless corpse, what boy by the hearth would think twice before drawing steel when his temper flared? The North did not forget. It hoarded stories of men like Egil and Grettir, the way it hoarded iron and salt, precious and dangerous, reminders that freedom without binding was not freedom but chaos. So when the old men spoke the names aloud in smoky halls, they did not spit them like curses nor praise them like saints. They let the tales stand as they were raw, bright, heavy with frost and iron. A lesson carved in memory deeper than any rune stone, a reminder that for every man who dreamed of shaking the law's yoke from his neck, there was another waiting to raise the pole, gather the hounds, and carry out the final word that held the North together in the long night. At the edge of the known world, where the last farm fences gave way to dark ridges and pine woods that swallowed sound, the outlaw learned what it meant to live beyond every bond that made a man human. In the hush beneath snow-heavy branches, he built his life from scraps. Scraps of warmth, scraps of stolen food, scraps of memory that slipped further from him with each passing season. The first nights were always the same. The condemned man would flee far enough that the glow of hearth fires flickered out behind him. He would listen for the dogs, the calls of young hunters, eager to earn their father's praise. If he heard them, he ran deeper, feet numb in the drifts, hands raw from clawing branches aside in the blind dark. When the sounds fell away, the new silence pressed in thick and patient. Then the real trial began. A free man in the circle of the thing was never truly alone. If winter bit too hard, a neighbour might lend dried fish or grain. If a calf sickened, kin would share a portion of their herd. A roof was never just wood and turf. It was the promise that you belonged under it. For the níðingr, that promise was ash. The roof was the sky. The walls were thickets, heavy with frost. Those who survived beyond the first storm did so by learning to become less than men, more like ghosts, drifting at the margin of the living world. Some made their dens in old charcoal pits, burrowed deep among roots where the soil held the last warmth of the earth. Others built lean-tos from spruce branches and deer hide, camouflaged so well that even the keenest hunter's eyes might slide past them twice before the flicker of a fire betrayed the truth. They stole. They had to. At the edge of farms, a cow's last winter fodder might vanish under cover of snow. A fishing line left overnight beneath river ice would come up bare, the outlaw's rough-cut hand lines tucked into a ragged cloak as he moved on before dawn. Sometimes they left a mark behind a carcass gutted wrong, a fence cut open. The villagers read these signs in the morning frost and spoke the outlaw's name only in a whisper, lest the shame slip through the door and poison their hearth. For all their cunning, not every hunt was swift. The woods were vast in those days, older than the boundary stones that men planted to feel bigger than the wild. An outlaw who knew the secret streams and hidden passes could slip away again and again. Some did so long enough that their shame faded into rumour the bogeyman children dreamed of when they heard a branch snap outside the longhouse walls. Yet the North's mercy was thin. Spring might spare a man the worst of the cold, but the hunger that winter sowed bloomed in his belly long after the snows melted. Roots could be dug, fish speared under river ice, but few outcasts died with full bellies. The luckiest hunted deer like wolves, taking what meat they could drag back to their hidden burrows. The unluckiest found their bones whitening beside pitiful fires, hands still clutching traps that caught nothing but frost. Stories tell of outlaws who turned to the old ways when desperation gnawed their pride raw. In the deep woods, some whispered bargains to half-forgotten spirits. The landvatir, the hidden ones, who might spare a crumb of luck if given a token in blood or breath, a tooth buried at a tree's root, a scrap of hair tied to a standing stone. Such rites were older than the cross, older than Odin himself, scraps of belief that clung like moss to the North's hidden corners. Even so, the spirits did not give freely. An outlaw who called on them too boldly might find himself hunted by more than hounds and men. Old women muttered that sometimes the forest itself closed around a níðingr, swallowed him up so completely that not even his ghost found its way back to the boundary stones. But most ended the same way, a farm dog barking in the dusk, a trail of broken snow, a handful of young men with spears and rough-cut shields, voices low so as not to frighten off the easy kill before they closed in. They might find him curled beneath a ridge, dreaming of bread fresh from an oven he'd never see again. Sometimes he fought, more often he fled the chase short, the end quicker than the winter's hunger that would have done the same by slower degrees. What did he think? That final moment before the blade fell or the spear found the hollow between his ribs. Did he remember the circle of the thing, the faces turned away when the law speaker named him Wolf's Head? Did he taste the last mouthful of warmth from a hearth he would never sit beside again? Or was his mind already gone, chewed thin by cold nights, and the fear that no man's shadow would ever stand beside his again? For those who found the body, there was no burial with hymns or runes carved on stone. They dragged what was left to the edge of the fields or the shore, weightless as a sack of offal. Sometimes they piled rocks over him to keep the scavengers at bay, not out of pity, but to keep the shame of his bones from washing back into the village like floodwater. They might spit once for good measure, wipe the blood from their blades, then walk home through the same woods that had hidden him so well for so long. At the longhouse, a father would nod to his son, pride hidden behind the stiff curl of his mouth. The boy who brought down a níðingr was no boy. Now he was a man who had proven he would not flinch when the law demanded a hard hand. No silver changed hands, no crown rewarded the kill. The reward was in the hush that settled back over the village, in the surety that the circle of trust was sealed once more. The pole still rotted on its hill, but its curse had run its course. So the fringe of the north, the deep woods, the hidden marshes, the half-remembered trails that curled beyond the last hayfields, became the outlaw's country and his grave in the same breath. And for those who gathered each spring at the thing, who planted their seed in thin soil and whispered oaths to gods old and new, it was enough to know that the wild always waited, sharp as an axe, for any man who dared betray the firelight that made him more than a beast among trees. When a man lost his place among the living, the North did not call him simply an outlaw or a criminal. It called him Varga í Veum, the wolf in the sanctuary. A name that hissed through the smoke haze of longhouses, a word half curse, half warning, that this man was no longer bound by any oath that made him human. He was wolf-headed now, a shape the law gave him when it tore him from the circle of kin. The wolf in the Old North was never just an animal. It was the shape the wild took when it slipped its leash and tested the fences men built from wood and trust. Wolves came at night, hungry shadows with yellow eyes that flickered just beyond the cattle pens. They struck without warning, teeth on warm throats, paws silent where the snow muffled every plea for help. They were feared because they hunted not from malice, but need, and a man cast out by the thing was no different. When the law speaker named a man Varga í Veum, it meant he had become like the wolf that stalked the edge of the byre, a creature outside the bounds of kinship and custom, whose presence threatened the thin skin of safety that wrapped every farmstead. He was not simply banished, he was hunted, because to leave him alive was to let hunger and desperation claw at the settlement's fragile peace. The forest was vast, but fear was always larger. In the sagas, these wolfmen drift through the pages like ghosts wrapped in furs. Some, like Grettir, wore the name as a second skin, meeting hunters' spears with iron laughter and the swing of an axe that turned blood to steam in the winter air. Others melted so completely into the wilderness that no fire ever betrayed their camp. For years they lingered like curses, stories parents used to hush children whose feet strayed too close to the boundary stones. But to live as a wolf in the sanctuary was not freedom. It was a long, slow erasure. When a man was cast out, the thing did not simply drive him away. It stripped him of all that named him. No guest right to claim shelter by another's hearth. No voice at the thing to plead his case if he was wronged in turn. No kin who might demand vengeance for his death, or speak his name beside the burial mound when the sea took his bones. To the law-abiding Norse mind, This was more terrible than death itself. A good death on a raid, in defence of kin, beneath a high shield wall, sealed a man's place in memory. Songs were sung of him. Swords were passed down in his name. Even the humblest farmer, if he kept faith with the law and his kin, would sleep beneath turf or stone, his grave marked with runes, to tell the living who lay beneath. The wolfman's grave was the unmarked hollow, in a snowdrift or a cairn stacked by strangers. No runes, no songs, only silence. Yet the wolfman was not only pitied or hunted, he was also feared. Fear made him a spirit in the night, a flicker at the edge of torchlight, a curse that might slip under the door with the wind. Some outcasts leaned into that fear, crafting it into armour stronger than any mail shirt. A stolen cloak of wolf fur, a mask of bone, the sound of a howl that startled farm dogs into barking at shadows. The forest gave them teeth when the law had stripped them of every other defence. It was said that some wolfmen took on the ways of the old berserkers, men who bound themselves to the shape and hunger of the beast when battle demanded they leave their humanity behind. In the hush of the North's deep forests, a man driven far enough from kin and fire might find it easy to believe that the line between man and wolf could blur. The stories told of hunters finding signs, strange runes scratched into tree bark, piles of bones arranged like offerings, footprints that shifted from boot leather to paw shape in the crusted snow. Did the outcasts truly become beasts? Or was it only the mind's trick the fear of good folk made flesh by moonlight and rumour? No one could say. But every hunter who trod a wolfman's trail through the dark pines carried a charm carved from bone, a whispered prayer to gods both old and new that the thing he cornered would bleed like a man when the spear went in. For those who stayed within the circle, who felt the warmth of the hearth, who trusted the fences to keep cattle in, and wolves out the figure of the wolf-headed man, was a lesson sharp as an axe's edge. A man who broke trust did not just risk death, he risked becoming the very thing the community most feared. The beast who knows your name, who knows the bend of every hidden trail, who understands the weaknesses in the hedge and the latch. A creature who once sat beside you, laughed over ale, helped raise your roof beam, and now moved through the night, with empty eyes and hunger for company denied. The word Varga survived long after the old things faded, long after the pole of shame rotted back into the soil. In old Norse law codes, scrawled by Christian scribes, the same term lingers like a buried fang wolf's head, the man with a price on him who may be hunted without guilt. In later tongues, it drifts into outlaw ballads, into whispers of highwaymen and forest bandits who defied the king's men and vanished between trees that never quite gave up their secrets. Yet for the Northmen who first spoke it aloud, in the hush of the thing, it was no romantic curse. It was a sentence cold as the soil that swallowed nameless bones. To be a wolf in the sanctuary was to be the lesson that kept fences mended, that kept tempers bridled when ale soured the tongue, that reminded every man within the circle that no freedom was worth the price of losing your place at the fire. And so the forest kept its wolves, some on 4 legs, some on 2. The pole of shame pointed at the farmstead door. The hunters waited with hounds at heel, and beyond the last ridge where the stars pooled silver on snow, the wolfman moved through the dark alone, the sanctuary forever closed behind him. In the long dark of the north, law was not parchment sealed with wax, or the trembling Latin of a monk's quill. It was a whisper carried from father to son, a memory that clung to the roof beams of the longhouse and the stones of the thing. And at its heart, hidden beneath the calm words of the law speaker and the silver exchange to settle debts, was terror. The cold knowledge that to stand outside the circle of trust was to stand alone against a world eager to swallow you whole. It was this fear that stitched men together more tightly than any king's guard could hope to do. In lands where the sea rose to drown fields overnight and winter's teeth found every crack in the turf walls, there was little room for disorder. You could lose a season's hay to storm, you could lose cattle to wolves, but you could not lose trust in the man whose fields lay next to yours. The law and the terrible punishments it promised made sure of it. When the law speaker's staff struck the frozen earth, and a man's name was spoken as níðingr, the word spread through the village faster than the cry of gulls on the wind. Neighbours spoke it behind closed doors. Wives murmured it as they dragged fresh rushes across the longhouse floor. Children heard it in fragments as they pressed close to the hearth, sensing that something vast and final had shifted in the air around them. The man who was cast out did not simply vanish. His absence radiated like heat from a dying fire, a hollow in the world that reminded everyone how thin the line was between belonging and exile. When two men quarrelled at the edge of a field, a fence broken, a calf found dead on the wrong side of a stone marker, their hands might drift toward the hilts of their knives. But then the older one would remember the pole on the ridge, the one that stood for half a season, pointing its curse at another man's ruin. He would think of the hunt that came after, the dogs that bayed through the birch thickets at dawn, the long silence in the byre when the body came back with no name attached. And he would spit in the grass, curse the gods under his breath, and offer silver instead. Better a small shame settled with coin than a great one that turned a man to a wolf at the door. This was the hidden blade of Viking law, not the brute edge of the axe alone, but the threat of being cut out like rot from wood. Death was simple. Blood spilled on a raid might bring songs. A life lost in defence of land or kin could be a badge worn by generations. But to live while the living turned away was a wound that did not close. The North could forgive many things theft repaid, a wound atoned for in silver, an insult settled in single combat beneath the watch of kin. But some things poisoned too deeply. Betrayal of guest, right, murder of bloodkin, cowardice that left a man's oath broken on his tongue. For these, there was no coin heavy enough to balance the scales. So the fear held. It held in the hush of the thing, where men who had crossed oceans and burned villages for plunder still lowered their eyes when the law speaker named a man Outlawry. It held in the way a wife might pause before offering bread to a wanderer at dusk, her mind flicking to the pole on the hill. Was this man merely hungry, or was his name rotting somewhere on another fjord's wind? It held in the quick glance shared between neighbours when a stranger came to trade at the boundary stone, carrying goods no one could trace. To outsiders, the priests who came with crosses and parchment, the Frankish scribes who wrote of savage pagans howling at monastery doors, such justice seemed barbaric, fit for wild men in sealskin cloaks. But they mistook the raw edge for chaos, when in truth it was the last line against it. In the soft courts of Europe, a criminal might rot in a stone cell, his body confined but his kin left untouched. In the north, the criminal's shame infected the bone and blood of everyone who called him family. It was not the spear that enforced the law so much as the fear of watching your children's names curdle when the thing spoke yours in judgment. This was why no walls were needed. The forest did not care if a man's heart still beat it, cared only that he had no hearth waiting for him. The sea did not weigh the worth of silver rings on a man's arm if he could not find a crew to stand beside him. A man alone in this land was no man at all. The law knew this truth. It whispered it every time a father took his son's hand and pointed to the pole half rotted in the field. Break the bond, and the bond will break you. In the hush before sleep, as wind slipped its fingers through gaps in turf roofs, men and women thought of the circle they sat inside, the warmth of shared breath, the low murmur of kin swapping news over bowls of sour ale, and somewhere out in the pines beyond the last fence, they imagined the figure of the níðingr cloak ragged with thorns, hands red from the cold, eyes turned toward the distant smear of firelight he would never touch again. In that shadow, the law's terror took shape. It was the unspoken guard at every threshold, the silent vow that the thing's word, once spoken, held more weight than any crown's seal. So long as the fear lived, the circle held. And so long as the circle held, the North endured. A harsh land where trust was dearer than gold, and the price for betraying it was not prison, but the endless silence of a world that turned its face away. When the first priests came north, in the wake of traders and kings hungry for silver and souls, they carried with them books bound in calfskin and crosses of hammered gold. They came with soft words about mercy and forgiveness, about the Lamb who bore the world's sins so that no man would stand alone before the grave. They spoke of heaven and hell, of saints whose relics could heal wounds no iron blade could touch. And they found themselves standing before a people whose law was older than any parchment. They brought a people who knew that the fiercest punishment was not fire or gallows, but the silence that followed when one's name turned to rot. The clash was not always fought with axes. Often it began in whispers around the hearth. A chieftain's second son, gone south to serve a Frankish lord, returned wearing a thin band of silver around his neck, a cross to ward off the weight of his own sins. A trader's daughter, wed to a Saxon merchant, brought back strange words about a God who forgave all, if only you spoke the right words to the right man behind stone walls. And slowly, those words pushed against the harsh edges of the North's old customs, like Thor pushing under the winter's crust. In the halls where the things still gathered beneath open sky, the priests saw a world they could not control with penance and confession alone. They watched as a man who had stolen from his kin was declared níðingr and hunted through the pines. No priest beside him to bless his passing or promise him absolution in some distant paradise. They spoke of prisons and fines, of binding a sinner in chains until he begged forgiveness. But the law speaker's staff struck the earth just as it always had, and the pole still rose on the hill when the circle judged that the crime had cut too deep for silver to mend. To the priests, such law was savagery, the stubborn marrow of a people they hoped to tame with parchment and saints' bones. They preached that Christ forgave the worst murderer if he bent his knee at the altar. Yet here in the North, a man could be turned to a ghost for a single betrayal of guest rights or the killing of a brother in anger. Mercy, they argued, was the mark of a true faith. But the North knew mercy too, just not the kind that left a wound festering beneath soft words. Where a foreign court might offer sanctuary in a holy place, an abbey wall that turned a criminal into a penitent, the North offered no such door. There was no refuge behind a carved oak church if the thing named you wolf-headed. A chieftain's hall could hide you for a night, but when dawn rose, the kin who sheltered you risked the same curse nailed to their own doorpost. The law was not iron bars, but the fear that spread through every neighbour's sleep. In this land, a man might beg Christ's mercy and still find the dogs at his back when the pole on the ridge turned its blind wooden head to his farm. Yet the clash was not only about justice, it was about who owned the right to judge at all. The priests brought the word of foreign kings, who claimed to rule by divine grace lords, who built stone churches and sent bishops to bind the wild tongues of the North with ink and seal. But here, the kings rose from the same soil as the farmers and raiders they ruled. A chieftain's power came not from crosses on silk banners, but from the circle that weighed his word when the wind blew cold through the thing's clearing. If he forgot that, if he tried to bend the old customs too sharply to the foreign gospel, he risked finding himself on the wrong side of the pole. Stories passed from coast to coast of kings who tried to root out the old punishments in favour of softer Christian grace. Olaf Tryggvason, king of Norway, breaker of idols, brought priests in his wake who promised baptism in rivers where the old gods once drank blood. He threatened death to those who clung too fiercely to Thor's hammer and Odin's runes. But even Olaf knew better than to strip the thing of its teeth entirely. He saw what happened when the pole did not stand. Feuds flared, kin killed kin, and the circle broke apart like ice on spring rivers. Mercy alone could not hold a land where winter never forgave hunger. So the two laws coiled around each other, the harsh old word and the softer promise of the cross. A man might swear his soul to Christ inside a timber church on Sunday, yet if he betrayed his brother on Monday, the law speaker would still stand before him under open sky, staff in hand, pole waiting behind him if the circle's word demanded it. The priest might whisper that no sin was too deep for grace, but the wind off the fjord carried a colder truth. Here, trust was life's breath, and betrayal was the same as death. Slowly, piece by piece, the softer law did begin to slip in. Wealthy kings, eager to match the grandeur of southern courts, ordered cells built near their great halls. Chains forged by blacksmiths, once bent to making sword rivets, now locked thieves in cramped rooms where they wasted into shadows. Some priests dreamed aloud of monasteries that would serve as sanctuaries for the desperate stone walls, thick enough to keep vengeance outside and the sinner's prayers inside. But even then, an outlaw who took shelter there might find a spear waiting at the door when he stepped outside, for the law of the thing did not bow easily to Latin prayers. In time, the pole rotted. The word nith faded from law codes, replaced by softer terms that could be recorded in letters instead of memory. But deep beneath the roots of farm walls and boundary stones, the old terror lingered like frost in the soil. It whispered that a man's word still mattered more than any cross or crown, that trust was the chain that bound the living together, and to break it was to be left alone where no sermon could find you. So the North took what it needed from Christendom: mercy for the soul, forgiveness for small failings, hope that some sins might be scrubbed clean on the other side of the grave. But in the hush beneath the pines, when the wind carried no sound but the crack of branches under a hunter's boots, the old law waited, hard as iron, patient as the snow. They came north, clutching books bound in calfskin and relics tucked in reliquaries of silver and bone. Missionaries from soft kingdoms where kings wore silk and churches rose like stone ships above the peasants' fields. Men who believed words could tame the wind and prayer, could melt the iron from a man's heart. They stepped off creaking ships onto salt-crusted docks and found themselves in a world that tested every promise they carried in their bloodless hands. The first to land were met with curiosity more than blades. Traders understood profit well enough to give a listening ear to new gods if they promised better luck on the sea lanes. A silver cross could sit beside a Thor's hammer on the same neck if it meant the market stayed open another day. But these priests came not to trade, but to change the marrow of a people who had long since learned that mercy had its place, and that place ended where betrayal began. When they heard of the thing, the missionaries thought they saw a sign of hope. Here were assemblies of free men gathered in peace, speaking law aloud rather than kneeling before a king's mailed fist. Was this not proof that the gospel could take root among a people already halfway tamed by their own words? They sat on the edges of these gatherings, crosses dangling on thin chains, parchment, ready to record the moment when pagan tongues would soften under the weight of Christ's mercy. Then they saw the pole. They watched as neighbours, kin, men who had worked the same fields and carried each other's roof beams in the lean seasons, gathered beneath a low sky to raise a sharpened post at the boundary of a man's land. They saw the horse's head severed clean, lashed to the top, its tongue pinned through its teeth with an iron nail so it would leer forever toward the homestead it cursed. They heard the law-speaker's voice carry across the frost-bitten ground, naming the man who owned that farm níðingr, the unclean, the oath-breaker, the wolf at the door. The missionaries shivered under their cloaks. They told themselves this was a relic of darkness that could not survive the candle flame of Christ's truth. They argued that no man's soul should be hunted like a beast through the forests, no matter the crime. Did not the good book say that even the worst sinner might be brought home like the lost sheep to the shepherd's arms? But when they spoke these words aloud, they found their breath frosting in air that did not care for Latin or gospel. They watched the circle of the thing stand unmoved, each man's eyes flat as a frozen lake. To these people, betrayal was not a sin to be washed away with whispered penance. It was rot in the beam that held up the longhouse roof let it spread, and the whole shelter would crumble when winter winds howled. They tried to argue. They pointed to their crosses. They spoke of confession, of prisons, to hold the wrongdoer safe until his soul could be mended. But the Norse laughed. What good was a stone cell when a man's name still poisoned every corner of his clan's hall? Better that the land itself cast him out. Better that the wild finished what the thing began, so the circle could hold unbroken. So the missionaries wrote letters home to bishops in York, to kings in Francia and Saxony, letters that spoke of a people noble in spirit but savage in custom, chained by fear of the old gods and the older terrors they carried in their bones. They told tales of poles crowned with rotting horse heads, of men driven barefoot through forests where the cold did what no hangman could do. They painted the north in brushstrokes of horror and heathen cruelty, hoping their lords would send more gold, more books, more men in robes to soften these stubborn edges. Some tried to outlast the old ways by force. Kings who bent the knee to Rome sent men in iron helms to break the poles and drag the wolf-headed from the woods. They built chapels where the thing once gathered, blessing the ground with relics so that no shame-marked pole might ever stand there again. But the people did not forget. They raised new poles in secret clearings. They whispered the old words at night when the priest's Latin was drowned by the roar of the sea outside thin church walls. Others found a compromise. They took the bones of the Nith and hid them under new words. Outlawry lingered in the shadows of royal courts, no longer a pole at the boundary, but a parchment nailed to a church door, declaring that a man's life was forfeit, his soul left to beg mercy of God alone, if no kin would shelter him. The wolf in the sanctuary was caged in letters now, but the teeth remained. The missionaries never fully understood that for the North, the terror of exile was not born of cruelty, but of a deep knowledge that the wild could not be tamed by prayers alone. A community was afire on the edge of a vast darkness. The thing was the ring of stones that held that flame steady when the wind rose. If the circle failed, the wild came in. Hunger, feud, betrayal, rot in the beams, wolves at the byre door. So when the old women sang their half-pagan lullabies beside the hearth, and the young men glanced at the ridges when the dogs barked at dusk, the terror that made the law strong did not vanish under the priest's soft words. It remained in the hush of the pines and the faint memory of the pole, still standing somewhere beyond the last field, its horse's skull turned forever toward the land it once shamed. In the end, the missionaries brought books and forgiveness, but the North kept its memory of the forest, the wolf, the man who betrayed his kin, and found no door left open when the snow came. And somewhere in that frost-bitten hush, the old law still whispered that the worst fate was not to die, but to live alone while every hearth you ever knew burned bright without you. When the age of raiders gave way to the age of crowns, the North began to bind its own wildness in parchment and seals. Kings rose from the same soil that had birthed free farmers and wolf-headed outlaws alike. Men who had once sailed west with axe and shield now sat beneath carved roof beams, ringed by loyal jarls who pledged their swords not for plunder but for order. Yet, even a king's will could not stand alone in these lands where winter demanded trust tighter than iron chains. The old law still lived in the hush of the Thing. Every farmstead knew that a ruler might wear silver and silk, might drink wine from Frankish goblets, but if he broke faith with the law that shaped his people long before the first cross was planted on northern soil, his crown was just metal, a bright trinket to be torn away when the circle gathered. The kings learned quickly that power here was not just armies and ships. It was the hidden thread that ran through every bond of kinship, and custom the same thread that raised the pole when a man's shame could not be paid in silver. So they did not sweep away the old ways overnight. Instead, they carved them into oak and inked them onto calfskin, folding the harsh memory of exile and outlawry into codes that could be read by clerks in dark chambers long after the law speaker's tongue fell silent. It was a strange marriage, ancient words spoken in frost, bitten fields now trapped under the same Latin script that bound the charters of cathedrals and the decrees of foreign courts. A thief's hand might still be cut in some regions. In others, a king's judge might weigh the same crime in coins minted with a Christian king's face. But the memory of the pole still lingered at the edge of the king's court, a whisper that not all wounds could be sealed with silver alone. In Norway, King Olaf Haraldsson, later called Saint Olaf by foreign tongues, eager to claim him for Rome, sought to tame the Thing's old teeth with the cross in one hand and the sword in the other. He ordered new codes, drafted by scribes, trained in the monasteries of England, blending the threat of exile with fines, prisons, and penance. Yet even Olaf knew that to strip the Thing of its right to cast a man out was to invite chaos back into the hall. He balanced the new mercy of confession with the old terror of outlawry, promising heaven to the repentant, but leaving the forest open for those who refused to bow. Across the sea in Iceland, that stubborn rock at the world's cold fringe, the Althing endured. There, men gathered each summer on the Law Rock, their voices carrying over the lava fields, while the Atlantic roared just beyond sight. They too carved law onto vellum, but the heart of it stayed the same. A man's word, once broken, could cost him more than life. He could still be named Wolf's Head. The hunt, the pole, they faded from sight as the centuries turned, but the circle's memory held tight to the threat behind the word. Over time, the kings grew more cunning. They learned to replace fear of the forest with fear of royal cells. Stone fortresses rose at river mouths, and along trade roads, walls thick enough to hold men whose crimes would once have sent them fleeing into the pine woods. The threat of the hunt was traded for the certainty of the dungeon. Where once a boy earned his place as a man by tracking a níðingr through drifting snow, now he might wear a king's colours and guard iron gates against escape. Yet for all this shift, something colder than iron bars lingered in the North's marrow. The old terror survived in silence, in the glance traded when a man's oath wavered, in the hush that fell over the hall when someone spoke too freely of betrayal. Written codes might soften a crime into a fine, but behind the ink lay the unspoken promise that any man could still find himself alone, beyond the fences, if he cut too deep at the roots of trust. Even the church, that patient spider spinning webs of parchment and penance, could not sweep away the memory entirely. Priests might speak of confession and absolution, but in the long nights when storm winds rattled the doors and the wolves howled at the frozen ridge, men still feared the shame that could turn a name sour in the mouths of neighbours. They still feared the old word nith, even when it no longer appeared on the king's parchment. They still whispered that to lose place and kin was to lose life twice over, once in the body, once in the name that outlived it. So the kings ruled, but they ruled through compromise. They bent the old customs into scrolls and seals, taught young scribes to set runes into letters that foreign monks could understand. They offered sanctuary to outlaws who repented, if they could find a priest to speak for them, yet behind every promise of mercy was the echo of the pole on the hill. The people remembered. They remembered that no crown shone bright enough to blind them to betrayal. And in the quiet moments, when the king's hall fell silent, but for the pop and hiss of pitch in the fire, there were those who still wondered, was it truly better to lock a man in chains than to cast him into the wild? Did stone walls cleanse a crime more cleanly than the cold teeth of hunger and snow? No scribe ever found an answer that soothed every heart. The North accepted both the new and the old, binding them together like ship's planks under iron rivets. The king's law might hold a man's body in a cell, but the people's law still watched the door, waiting to see if his name would ever be welcome inside again. And somewhere, beneath boundary stones and churchyard turf, the old poles rotted quietly in the earth, relics not of savagery, but of a truth that outlasted crowns, that in this land of ice and shadow, the harshest law was not written by kings, but carved into the bones of the people it bound together. Long after kings nailed their seals to vellum, and priests blessed the stone halls that echoed with Latin prayers, there were corners of the north where the old terror of the pole clung to the land like frost clings to the last shadow at dawn. These were places where the reach of crowns thinned to mist, where fjords coiled deep into mountains that no king's rider crossed in winter, where islands rose out of grey surf, like the backs of sleeping beasts, too far for iron laws to land easily on their shores. In these wild places, the thing still gathered on grass, flattened by the same boots that walked it for centuries. Men still stood in rough circles, arms folded across broad chests, while the law speaker's staff tapped out words older than any bishop's sermon. They listened to the crown's new codes when they arrived by ship, unrolled from scrolls, damp with sea salt and foreign ink. They nodded, polite enough not to anger the king's envoys who carried these papers in wax-sealed boxes. But when those envoys sailed away, their hulls heavy with wool and fish and silver tribute, the old ways settled back over the land like snow covering stone. Iceland was the most stubborn of all, a land carved from fire and frozen seas, where each farmstead stood apart on open turf, bound to neighbours by fragile strands of kin and cattle swaps, not by any iron-fisted ruler in a distant hall. Here, the Althing rose each summer on a plain split by dark lava and cold rivers. A parliament, the Christian scribes called it, but for the people gathered there, it was something older and harder. A place where memory spoke louder than any king's seal. When a feud flared, when an insult slid under the skin like a blade, the people still weighed whether silver could mend what pride had split. If not, if a man's shame seeped too deep, if his betrayal cracked the beam that held the roof, the same old word was waiting. Outlawry, outlaw, wolf's head. Not every sentence led to the hunt anymore. By then, The king's law called for fines, for iron chains, for church, buried penance. But the land remembered, and so did the people. A man declared outlaw in these wild parts might find no dogs on his trail, no band of eager young sons seeking glory in his blood. Instead, he found something worse, the slow frost of every door shutting when he drew near. The look in his brother's eyes when he stepped onto the threshold, the look that said, "We share blood, but not shame." The hush in the hall when his name was spoken. The sudden stillness of neighbours who once laughed with him over spilled ale and salted fish. The king's paper might offer him mercy, but no parchment could warm his back when no hearth would hold him. In the Faroes, Orkney, Shetland Islands lashed by winds that could strip the bark from driftwood in a single night, the pole still rose in quiet places when need demanded it. Not every crime called for it. Not every shame justified the raising of horse and runes. But when betrayal cut to the root, a kinsman murdered over a boundary stone, a guest poisoned at a feast, the people did not wait for envoys and royal decrees. They gathered under open sky. They spoke the old words. They raised the pole where salt wind would gnaw the mare's head clean in days, leaving only a skull turned forever toward the home now cursed by the thing's voice. Travellers from the south wrote of these outposts with a mix of horror and grudging awe. They marvelled that in places so small a man's name could carry more weight than a king's writ, that a single whisper of nith could send a man to the edge of the sea, a ghost among his own kin. They could not understand how a people so fierce in trade and so keen for new ideas could cling so stubbornly to such ancient terror. But they did not see what the people themselves saw every winter, how thin the walls were against the cold, how quick a man's trust could fail when hunger came knocking, how fragile a roof beam became if the rot of betrayal set in where neighbours once shared salt and fire. So the kings turned their gaze elsewhere. They gathered silver in coastal towns, built cathedrals in low valleys, where trade ships anchored safely behind breakwaters of stone. They let the wild places be, partly because they were small and far, partly because they knew better than to snap the thread that bound these hard coasts to crown and cross. The outlaws who fled into these fringes knew this too. They knew the king's men might not ride up every wind-swept fjord to drag them in chains to a stone cell. But they also knew that no sanctuary waited for them under turf roofs or among the cold, patient stones of their ancestors' burial mounds. They were alone the moment the thing's word cast them out alone, as any wolf at the door. In time, the missionaries came even to these far edges. They raised simple churches of driftwood and turf, taught children to scratch the Christ mark into runes on rough boards. They preached of mercy, of the Lamb who forgave all. Many listened. Many bent their heads at Easter, hands folded, mouths shaping Latin prayers they barely understood. But when the door opened and the wind howled through the gap, the old fear lingered behind their eyes, the knowledge that no priest's blessing could lift the curse if the circle judged a man unworthy to stand within it. And so, on these hard coasts and ragged islands, the memory of the pole did not vanish when crowns rose on distant thrones. It sank deeper instead, a seed in thin soil that remembered the terror that held the world together when storms came in off the sea, and trust was the only warmth that did not fade when the fire turned to ash. Long after the last pole of shame rotted into the turf, and the law speaker's voice faded beneath the chants of churchmen, the memory of the níðingr and the wolf's head stalked the north through stories sharper than any blade, more enduring than any crown. The sagas carried it forward, threading outlawry through every cold draught that stirred the rushes on the longhouse floor when winter pressed against the door. By firelight, men who now bent the knee to kings still listen to tales of those who would not bow? Or could not men who crossed the line that bound honour to hearth, and found themselves turned loose into a land that had no pity for those who could not stand within the circle? Grettir Asmundarson, that restless shadow on Iceland's wind-bitten slopes, lives yet wherever the Íslendinga Sögur are spoken. He stands in the pages of vellum with shoulders broad enough to wrestle trolls in the dark, yet unable to wrestle free from the thing's cold verdict that named him Wolf's Head when his anger outpaced his kin's patience. His saga is not clean. It does not wash him in glory, nor smear him only in filth. He is both hero and horror, strong enough to guard a homestead alone for 3 winters, stubborn enough to spit in the face of any who told him to yield, yet doomed to die like a cornered beast on a cold rock, far from the fire that once bore his name. For every Grettir there is an outlaw half forgotten, a flicker between the saga's lines. The boy who took a sheep in the lean month and found his mother's door bolted when the law-speaker's staff struck. The kinsman who struck a cousin down over a fence line blurred by drifting snow, who fled into the mossy ravines where only ravens knew his name. Some come back as ghosts in the tales, shadows that knock on shutters at night, whispering their hunger at the edges of sleep. Others linger only in the weight that silence brings to any hall when a man's honour is named aloud. The sagas did not write these figures as monsters alone. They carved them as mirrors, showing a people what lay on the far side of trust. To hear the tale of a níðing was to feel the warmth of your own place at the hearth more sharply. It was to understand that the cost of betrayal was not just blood on snow, but the long, slow dying of one's name, until even the stones forgot who you had once been. For the skalds, the poets who stitched memory together with words sharp as fishhooks, the outlaw was a gift too rich to waste. He was the fear that made a farmer's oath stick when tempers ran hot. He was the caution in a warrior's promise before a raid. He was the flicker of thought in every chieftain's mind when silver could settle a feud more cleanly than the blade. Without the threat of the wolf-headed man crouched in the dark woods, what held the circle together when the storms came down from the mountains? The stories found a new hunger when the old beliefs cracked under the weight of the cross. Christian scribes bent low over their scripts, copying tales of blood feuds and pole-raised curses that seemed at odds with the soft mercy they preached. They tried to paint these old outlaws as relics of a pagan savagery, outgrown, yet they copied the sagas line for line, binding them in calfskin to survive fire and time alike. Even then, the outlaws in these stories refused to be tamed. They slipped between the lines of Latin prayers, howling like wolves in the margins where monks scrawled their notes. In the sagas, they still fought trolls at night, outwitted kings by day, paid for every scrap of stolen warmth with a life lived on the run. They bled, they begged, they cursed the gods when the forest gave them no mercy, and in the end they reminded those who read their names that no chain or parchment could hold back the old truth. Break faith, and you break yourself. Parents repeated these stories to sons who listened with wide eyes in the hush after chores were done. They made the boys shiver when the wind rattled the doors. They made them straighten their shoulders when they stood at the thing for the first time, axe haft warm in their palm, oath trembling on their tongue. The outlaw's echo was a warning, sharp enough to hold even the boldest braggart in check. And so outlawry outlived its poles and horses' heads nailed to rough-cut staves. It slipped into words, into memory, into the hush that fell whenever someone asked, "What price is too steep for pride? When is silver enough? When does a feud become a curse that eats your name down to bone?" Not every outlaw was cursed by shame alone. Some were lifted by the sagas into a defiance that felt almost noble lone figures who refused to kneel to kings, who laughed at fate as they slipped through iron nets meant to bind them like any common thief. They became the raw edge that kept a people honest, proof that a man could choose to stand alone, but he would pay for it with every last breath. Today, when scholars trace those old tales in crisp printed books, they marvel at the harshness of a world that hunted men like wolves. But the North still knows, beneath its bright cities and softened nights, that every law is only as strong as the memory that gave birth to it. The outlaw remains a shadow behind every oath, a flicker in the pine woods, a lesson inked into the sagas like frost locked deep in stone. Beneath the roots of birch and pine, the past sometimes leaves more than whispers. Though the pole of shame rotted back into the earth centuries ago, the land remembers in scraps of wood, hardened by centuries of frost, in stones sunk deep where boundary lines once cut kin from kin. The sagas hold the stories, but the soil holds the proof that the old law was not just spoken, but carved into the bones of the land itself. Archaeologists, with soft hands and bright eyes, come north every summer, picks and brushes in hand, hoping to find what the stories left behind. They know the outlines, the thing site, a low rise by a river, a circle of stones half swallowed by moss and heather. In Iceland, these places survive like scars that never fully heal. At Þingvellir, the law rock still juts from the lava plain, where free men once stood shoulder to shoulder, listening for the verdict that could bind them together or cast one of them into the wild with only his shame for company. They find the evidence not in grand halls or treasure buried beneath church altars, but in the lonely places where the condemned once crept like shadows at the world's edge. Caves in upland valleys, dark gaps between boulders blackened by smoke, where no hearth ever warmed a family, only a single outlaw huddled over a flicker of stolen flame. Here and there they uncover scraps, a cracked bone comb, the iron rivets of a knife, whose blade has long since rusted to nothing. Marks of a man who once lived outside the circle, scraping survival from roots and the bones of animals no one else would touch. The caves of Grettir Asmundarson are real enough. High in the drifts above Bjarg, where his kin once farmed the thin soil, lie crevices worn deeper by the passage of time than by any man's hands. They say he hid there when the snow sealed every other door. Inside, charred fish bones still lie in the damp earth, mixed with the teeth of sheep and goats, proof that even the strongest outlaw could not live on defiance alone. There are stones 2 low markers half lost in the heather, carved with runes so faint that only the patient sun at midsummer makes them speak again. Some scholars claim these boundary stones once stood at the edge of farmsteads cursed by a níðstang. When the pole came down, when the horse's skull fell into the grass, gnawed clean by time the stone remained, a rough memory no king's law could scrub away. In Sweden and Denmark, farmers tilling fields still stumble now and then on old poles buried beneath layers of turf. Not many survive wood rots fast when rain and snow work it like a plough. But sometimes a shaft of pine hardened by peat emerges, and at its end a tangle of bone, the broken jaw of a horse, teeth grinning through centuries of silence. When the archaeologists lift it free, they find the runes still cut into the wood curses, bound to a man's name long forgotten, yet the shape of his shame lingers like a frost that never melts. They find other hints too, hidden paths deep in the forest, so narrow that only one man could pass at a time, well worn by feet that never wanted to be found. Pits dug under tree roots, lined with flat stones to keep out the damp, big enough for one man to crawl inside with his stolen cloak and a bone knife ready for the hunter's hounds. When they test the soil, they find layers of ash, scattered fish scales, the pollen of plants that do not grow in the open, but only beneath the thick canopy of old woods. These tiny seeds and charred flakes speak louder than any saga telling of nights when the pole stood high on the hill and the outcast crouched in the dark, listening for dogs, waiting for the howl that might end his final breath. Yet, for all these glimpses, the outlaw remains a ghost that refuses to stand still for the shovel or the brush. The thing itself left little behind, no throne room, no fortress walls. Its seat was the sky, its floor the earth beaten flat by countless boots, its walls the circle of men whose word bound the north tighter than any stone prison could. The pole, too, was never meant to endure. It did its work in the minds of the living, not in the bones of the dead. Still, when the summer wind rustles the grass at Chingvalir, or the fjord mists slide like ghosts along an old path that once led to an outlaw's cave, the past murmurs through more than words. It hums in the cold hush where the law speaker once named a man níðingr. It lingers in the shape of the stones that still mark the edge of old farms' boundaries drawn not just in land, but in trust. The scholars and students come, notebooks open, their questions eager. They measure the stones, photograph the broken bones, trace the faint runes with gloved fingertips. They write papers, bind them in neat volumes that line the shelves of warm libraries far from the salt wind and iron sky of the north. But in the end, all their findings point back to the same truth the people once spoke aloud on these plains, that a man's place among his kin is his truest shelter, and when that is taken, all that remains is the cold whisper of the earth beneath his feet. So the traces lie waiting, in boundary stones, in soot-blackened caves, in the hollow left where a pole once stood, horse's skull nodding in the wind. Proof that the terror of exile was not just a story to frighten children by firelight, but a law etched into the land itself, patient as winter, ready to remind the living of what it cost to break the bond that held the wild at bay. Beyond the whale road and the grey reach of the North Sea, word of the Vikings' law travelled on the same winds that carried tales of burning monasteries and dragon-prowed ships. In cloisters from York to Reims, monks hunched over ink and parchment, quills scratching out lines that trembled with dread. Northmen have come savage men, godless men, men who honour no king but their own sword. Yet what truly haunted them was not only the axe or the torch, but the rumour that here, at the cold edge of Christendom, justice itself was something raw and ancient, a thing too fierce for the softer courts of Europe to comprehend. They wrote of berserkers who foamed at the mouth in battle, of raiders who split the doors of abbeys like rotten bark, but they also wrote of things. These open-air councils, where no gilded crown or stone cathedral shielded a man from his neighbour's tongue. They heard whispers that the north had no prisons thick enough to swallow a man whole, only the wild woods, the hunt, the terrible pole that rose at the edge of a condemned man's farm, horse's head rotting on its sharpened tip. To the scribes of Francia or Mercia, it was monstrous to hunt a man as if he were a wolf, to drive him out beneath a sky that offered no sanctuary, no holy ground to shield his flight. In the monasteries, the word outlaw was copied alongside prayers for protection, an exile without walls, a sentence carried out not by royal guards, but by the cold indifference of neighbours who turned their backs and the land that refused him shelter. These scribes, who wrote by candlelight behind thick abbey walls, saw their world bound in parchment and sealed in the name of kings who claimed to rule by the grace of God. Justice came robed in Latin. Penance, confession, fines, weighed in coin, struck from the same silver Vikings sometimes stole. But to them, The North's way seemed a wilderness of the spirit, a place where men were forced to stand so naked before their kin that a single betrayal could tear them out by the root, cast them into forests darker than any dungeon cell. Stories spread like frost. Merchants carried them south with furs and amber tails of poles crowned with horse skulls and runes that cursed a man's name so deeply no priest could scrub it clean. Pilgrims spoke in frightened whispers about farms where an entire household might turn its back on a son whose shame had grown too heavy to bear. Rumours bred rumours, that the Vikings worshipped wolves, that they carved men's hearts from their chests beneath aurora, lit skies, that their chiefs swore oaths to old gods with blood still wet on the grass. In truth, the law was older than these fears, older than the sagas that would later make it half legend. It was the iron ring of trust that kept small settlements alive when the winds cut deeper than any sword. But, from a distance, through the ink of frightened monks, it became something else, the shadow of a people so alien that no gospel could tame them, no king's banner could claim them fully. The fear fed itself. When Viking longships slipped up the Seine or the Thames, they did so with the dread of their savage customs trailing behind the blade. The men who leapt from those hulls carried more than axes. They carried the memory that at home, if they betrayed their own, their neighbours would turn on them like wolves at the scent of weakness. A Viking who could stand beneath the law speaker's judgment, who could bear the threat of outlawry if his courage failed, was a man who would not flinch when foreign gold glittered behind stone walls. And so the chroniclers painted them with broad, trembling strokes. Not just pagans, but wild men, more beast than Christian soul, bound to a law so cruel that even kings who ruled by sword and pyre recoiled at its sharpness. They wrote of the thing as if it were a gathering of savage judges thirsting for blood, never grasping that the same open circle that cast a man out was also the only shield that kept endless feuds from burning every fjord and farmstead to ash. Europe's kings took this fear and wove it into their own armour. The Viking became the reason for new fortresses, new taxes, new alliances sealed by iron and oath. Priests used the horror of the north to fill their churches. Pray harder, pay more tithes, build thicker walls, for the men who come from beyond the sea do not fear your holy ground. And beneath this dread lay a misunderstanding deeper than any ocean crossing, that these raiders were not lawless, but bound by a law too brutal for any cloistered monk to grasp. In the centuries that followed, when raids became trade, and trade became kingdoms, forged under crowns that called themselves Christian, the fear shifted but did not vanish. The echo of the wolf-headed outlaw lingered in border ballads and court whispers. Medieval Europe, so proud of its prisons and gallows, never quite trusted the wild north, even as it dressed its kings in ermine and crowned its new churches with crosses cast from melted plunder. What they missed in their chronicles was the truth that the same terror they found monstrous was also the root of the Vikings' fierce unity. The pole rose not only to shame, but to keep kin from feuding into ruin, to bind neighbours in trust when winter's hunger pressed at the door. It was a blade turned inward, a reminder that freedom had teeth, that to live among free men was to guard one's word more fiercely than any king's guard could. So Europe feared the lawless north not because it lacked law, but because its law was older, colder, spoken beneath open skies, where a man's name was his only fortress. And when the wind howled down monastery halls in the dead of winter, some monks might have wondered what strength there was in parchment alone when the wolves came scratching at the door. When the old sagas speak their final word about outlawry, they often circle back to a single figure, the last lone wolf pacing the cold margins of the known world, Grettir Asmundarson, whose life and death sealed the story of the North's fiercest law into memory deeper than any rune stone could hold. Long after the age of great raids ebbed into the age of kings and crosses, Grettir's shadow crept across Iceland's hard soil, like a ghost that refused to lie still. He was no common thief, nor a man who fled battle. He was a brawler, a boast-given flesh, a man whose temper burned too hot to be hemmed by kin or king. Stronger than most men, and stubborn as the mountains that loomed above his mother's farm, Grettir lived by his own iron will, and that will was both shield and curse. It began, as many of these tales did, a feud at the edge of a fire, harsh words that grew teeth, a killing that might have been mended by silver, if not for Grettir's pride. He could have bent his head, paid the fine, spoken honeyed words to neighbours whose goodwill mattered more than the coin itself. But Grettir did not bend. And so, with the law-speaker's staff struck firm against the lava plain at the Elthing, he was named Outlawry, Outlaw, Wolf's Head, forever hunted by any who dared take his blood without fear of vengeance. He fled into the folds of Iceland's wilderness, which suited him more than the closeness of farm walls and watchful neighbours. There he became a legend. In his own years, a man so fierce, he wrestled the things that haunted sheep pens and shadowed icy streams. He fought trolls, men said, ghosts that crept from burial mounds, thieves who thought to take what he guarded in his exile. He was the thing's own contradiction, the law's cast-off, and yet the only shield some farmsteads had when the wild pressed too close. But legend did not fill a belly, nor thaw a man's bones, when winter sealed, the valleys shut. Grettir stole warmth when he could. He crept to farmhouses at night, lifting a latch with rough fingers, while honest folk lay shivering behind barred doors. Some pitied him. A mother might leave a bowl of curds outside the byre, pretending she did not see the footprints in the morning frost. But pity turned dangerous fast to feed the wolf-headed was to risk the same verdict spoken at the thing. So Grettir grew lean, yet never tamed. For 19 years he evaded the hunt longer than any man-marked wolf in the north before him. Each spring, new hunters came to the caves, where he made his lair, swords sharp, spears balanced for the final thrust. They found traps instead, a trail erased by storms, a fire pit, cold for weeks, whispers among farmhands that the outlaw had moved on. Some who went seeking his head returned with wounds they dared not explain, or did not return at all. Yet no man outruns the law forever. The cold weight of it presses harder with each season. In the end, it was not a spear that struck Grettir first, but the rot of a wound no man could clean, betrayed by trickery and dark sorcery. So the saga claims his strength ebbed like a tide that knows it will never return. They found him on the rocky island of Drangi, where he had made his final stand with his half-brother, the sea at his back, the wind a knife in his chest. When his enemies landed, Grettir rose from his sickbed, sword in hand. Too weak to stand, he fought on his knees, roaring defiance that startled even the ravens perched on the sea cliffs. It took many blades to finish what the thing had begun years before, for even half dead, the last outlaw would not yield quietly to the sentence that hunted him through snow and storm. They cut off his head to prove the deed. No grave mound rose for him. His name lingered only in the saga's half-curse, half-boast a lesson carved into the hush that fell over farmhouses whenever a man's anger flared too quick, a reminder that to break the bond was to be hunted by more than iron. The forest was patient, the sea more so. Long after, mothers told the tale of Grettir to restless children when the wind clawed at the shutters. They spoke of his strength, of the trolls he felled, of the time he wrestled a draugr in a burial mound and won a cursed blade for his trouble. But always, at the edge of the tale, was the sharper truth, that no matter how strong a man's arm, how sharp his sword, no one stood alone forever. Not here. Not in this land where a man's worth was measured, not by how fiercely he fought, but by how well he held the trust of those who would speak his name when he was gone. The kings came, the crosses rose, the law crept into parchment thick as a bishop's robes, but Grettir's shadow stayed. The last outlaw reminded the North what it once demanded of those who broke the circle, that no walls would hold you, no chains would bind you, only the endless reach of the forest, the crack of branches underfoot, the final hush when the hunter's spears found your ribs beneath the frozen birch. So when the Althing gathered each summer, when the law-speaker's voice rose over the plain, and men weighed silver and pride in the same breath, they did so with the echo of Grettir's name in their chests. A name that said, "This law may be brutal, but it is ours, and if we break it, the land itself will remember with snow, with hunger, with wolves at the door." In the hush of northern nights, when frost etches runes on every shutter, the story of the pole, the wolf's head, and the circle of free men does not sleep. Though the poles of shame long ago rotted into earth, rich with the bones of cattle and the roots of old birch, though the law-speaker's staff stands silent beneath glass in a museum far from the roar of fjords, the terror that once kept the North bound together lingers not in wood or iron, but in the marrow of the stories people still tell when the winds press at the doors. For what the old law carved into these cold coasts was never only about punishment or the thrill of a hunt through snow-thick woods. It was a memory that trust was more vital than walls, that a man's name was his truest wealth, that no king's seal or priest's blessing could restore what the circle, once broken, stripped away forever. The North's harshest law was never written to frighten children, though it did. It was not shaped to prove savagery to southern scribes, though they believed it did. It was shaped to hold a world together when the dark pressed so close that a single betrayal could bring winter in through every cracked plank and unlatched door. The outlawry that so horrified the monks and foreign kings was never truly meant for monsters. It was for men like Bjorn, like Orm, like Grettir, men whose pride and anger, whose rage and fear made them test the circle's strength. And when the circle gave its final word, when the pole rose and the horse's skull turned its blind eyes toward home, the people saw not just cruelty, but proof that trust was iron. It could be forged, and it could break. Yet time, as it always does, softened the sharp edges. The kings brought iron locks and stone keeps. The churches raised timber roofs that swallowed confession in whispers and Latin prayers. Judges weighed crime in coin instead of curses. The pole faded to rumour, then to saga, then to footnotes in the dry books of scholars, who puzzled over why any people would cast a man out in a land so hungry for warm hands, to plough its thin fields and mend its frost-heaved fences. But the old terror never vanished. It simply slipped into other shapes the quick glance when a neighbour's promise cracks, the hush that settles in a hall when an old feud's name is spoken too near the hearth, the quiet weight in a man's chest when he knows that what binds him to his kin is not just love or blood, but the hard promise that trust will stand or he will stand alone. In Iceland, the Althing still gathers each year now, more ceremony than blood bond, more parliament than spoken circle. Tourists stand on the law rock and snap photographs where once a law speaker's voice decided whether a man might sleep in his own bed come winter, or vanish into the dark beyond the boundary stones. They see only sun on lava plains, clean paths trod by thousands of feet. But when the wind turns sharp off the glaciers, a whisper remains in that open sky, the memory that here, once, a word could make a man less than the forest wolves, and more alone than any death could grant. In hidden valleys, where boundary stones still lean under moss, farmers still find scraps. A splintered post where some old pole once rose, the scattered teeth of a horse, yellowed and brittle. They are relics now, reminders that the law was never just the spoken word, but a thing nailed into the earth, a warning visible to every eye that dared cross the line. Yet the real relic is not buried under turf or trapped behind glass. It walks still in the way the North holds its stories, in how it tells of feuds and ghosts, of names carried clean or broken. It lives in the sagas that remember outlawry not only as punishment, but as the blade that trimmed rot from the beam that held the longhouse roof steady when storms screamed through the rafters. When the wind rattles old doors, when snow drifts against the last fence and shadows slip through the pine, a child might ask, did they really hunt their own? Did they really drive men into the wild like beasts? And the elders answer, yes, but not because they loved the hunt, because they feared what came when trust failed more than they feared the dark. In the end, the Viking law that was too brutal for medieval Europe was never truly about blood. It was about silence, the silence that followed when a man's name turned sour on the tongue, when the circle turned away and the hearth grew cold. A silence so heavy, it shaped a people strong enough to sail from these cold coasts to the edges of the known world, to stand before kings who called them savage, and yet bent under the same iron when their gold failed them. So the pole stands no more. The wolf's head is no longer nailed to boundary stones. But in the hush of northern nights, when the hearth fire burns low and old tales drift like sparks into the rafters, the law that exiled men into the wild still whispers, keep your word, hold your trust. Stand within the circle, or the circle will close without you. And in that promise, harsh and cold as the wind off the fjord the north remains,